Hello from the underground. We are continuing along with Isaac Asimov's The Naked Sun. On chapter the 13th, a roboticist is confronted. Clarissa said, "Impossible. Skies above. Absolutely impossible." "Above or below, or any way you wish it. Is there an animal on the farm that's expendable? Get it and scratch it with the arrow and see what happens." "But why should anyone want to?" Bailey said harshly. "I know why. The question is, who?" "No one." Bailey felt the dizziness returning, and he grew savage. He threw the arrow at her, and she eyed the spot where it fell. "Pick it up," Bailey cried. "And if you don't want to test it, destroy it. Leave it there, and you'll have an accident if the children get at it." She picked it up hurriedly, holding it between forefinger and thumb. Bailey ran for the nearest entrance to the building, and Clarissa was still holding the arrow, gingerly, when she followed him back indoors. Bailey felt a certain measure of equanimity return with the comfort of enclosure. He said, "Who poisoned the arrow?" "I can't imagine." "I suppose it isn't likely the boy did it himself. Would you have any way of telling who his parents were?" "We could check the records," said Clarissa gloomily. "Then you do keep records of relationships?" "We have to, for gene analysis." "Would the youngsters know who his parents were?" "Never," said Clarissa energetically. "Would you have any way of finding out?" "He would have to break into the records room." "Impossible." "Suppose an adult visiting the estate and wanted to know who his child was." Clarissa flushed. "Very unlikely." "But suppose. Would he be told if he were to ask?" "I don't know. It isn't exactly legal for him to know. It certainly isn't customary." "Would you tell him?" "I'd try not to. I know Dr. 𝗓𝗲𝗓 wouldn't have. He believed knowledge of relationships was for gene analysis only. Before him, things may have been looser." "Why do you ask all this anyway?" "I don't see how the youngster could have motive on his own account. I thought that through his parents he might have." "This is all horrible." In her disturbed state of mind, Clarissa approached more closely than at any previous time. She even stretched out an arm in his direction. "How can it all be happening? The boss killed. You nearly killed. We have no motives for violence on Solaria. We all have all we want, so there is no personal ambition. We have no knowledge of a relationship, so there is no family ambition. We are all in good genic health." Her face cleared at once. "Wait. This arrow can't be poisoned. I shouldn't let you convince me it is." "Why have you suddenly decided that?" "The robot with Bick. He would never have allowed poison. It's inconceivable that he could have done anything that might bring harm to a human being. The first law of robotics makes sure of that." Bailey said, "Does it? What is the first law, I wonder?" Clarissa stared blankly. "What do you mean?" "Nothing. You have the arrow tested, and you will find that it is poisoned." Bailey himself was scarcely interested in the matter. He knew it for poison beyond any internal questionings. He said, "Do you still believe Mrs. 𝗓𝗲𝗓 to have been guilty of her husband's death?" "She was the only one present." "I see. And you are the only other human adult present at this estate at the time when I had just been shot at with a poisoned arrow," she cried energetically. "I had nothing to do with it." "Perhaps not. And perhaps Mrs. 𝗓𝗲𝗓 is innocent as well. May I use your viewing apparatus?" "Yes, of course." Bailey knew exactly whom he intended to view, and it was not Gladia. It came as a surprise to himself then to hear his voice say, "Get Gladia 𝗓𝗲𝗓." The robot obeyed without comment, and Bailey watched the manipulations with astonishment, wondering why he had given the order. Was it that the girl had just been the subject of discussion? Or was it that he had been a little disturbed over the matter of the end of their last viewing? Or was it simply the sight of the husky, almost overpowering, practical figure of Clarissa that finally enforced the necessity of a glimpse of 𝗧𝗲𝗲, but kind of counter-reiterant. He thought defensively. Jehoshaphat, sometimes a man has to play things by ear. She was there before him, all at once, sitting in a large upright chair that made her appear smaller and more defenseless than ever. Her hair was drawn back and bound into a loose coil. She wore pendant earrings, bearing gems that looked like diamonds. Her dress was a simple affair that clung tightly at the waist. She said in a low voice, "I'm glad you viewed, Elijah. I've been trying to reach you." "Good morning, 𝗧𝗲𝗲." "Afternoon, evening." He didn't know 𝗧𝗲𝗲𝗲's time, and he couldn't tell from the manner in which she was dressed what time it might be. "Why have you been trying to reach me?" "To tell you I was sorry. I had lost my temper last time we viewed. Mr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 didn't know where you were to be reached." Bailey had a momentary vision of Daniil still bound fast by the overseeing robots and almost smiled. He said, "That's all right. In a few hours I'll be seeing you." "Of course, if seeing me?" "Personal presence," said Bailey gravely. Her eyes wide and her fingers dug into the smooth plastic on the armchair. "Is there any reason for that?" "It is necessary." "I don't think..." "Would you allow it?" She looked away. "Is it absolutely necessary?" "It is. First, though, there was something else I must see. Your husband was interested in robots. You told me that, and I have heard it from other sources, but he wasn't a roboticist, was he?" That wasn't his training, Elijah." She still avoided his eyes. "But he worked with a roboticist, didn't he?" "𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗧𝗵𝗲, she said at once. "He's a good friend of mine." "He is," said Bailey energetically. 𝗧𝗲𝗲𝗲 looked startled. "Shouldn't I have said that?" "Why not, if it's the truth?" "I'm always afraid that I'll say things that will make me seem as though... You don't know what it's like when everyone is sure you've done something. Take it easy. How is it that 𝗧𝗵𝗲 is a friend of yours?" "No, I don't know. He's in the next state, for one thing. Viewing energy is just about nil, so we can just view all the time in free motion with hardly any trouble. We go on walks together all the time, or we did anyway." "I didn't know you could go on walks together with anyone." 𝗧𝗲𝗲𝗲 flushed. "I said viewing." "Oh, well, I keep forgetting you're an Earthman. Viewing in free motion means we focus on ourselves and we can go anywhere we want to without losing contact. I walk on my estate and he walks on his and we're together." She held her chin high. "It can be pleasant." Then, suddenly, she giggled. "Poor 𝗧𝗵𝗲. "Why do you say that?" "I was thinking of you thinking we walk together without viewing. He'd die if someone... He'd die if anyone could think that." "Why?" "He's terrible that way. He told me that when he was 5 years old he stopped seeing people. Insisted on viewing only. Some children are like that. 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗧," she paused in confusion, then went on. 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗧, my husband, once told me, when I talked about 𝗧𝗵𝗲, that more and more children would be like that too. He said it was a kind of social evolution that favored survival of pro-viewing. Do you think that's so?" "I'm no authority," said Bailey. "𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗧 wouldn't even get married. 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗧 was angry with him, told him he was antisocial and that he had genes that were necessary in the common pool, but 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗧 just refused to consider it." "Has he a right to refuse?" "No," said 𝗧𝗲𝗲𝗧 hesitantly. "But he's a very brilliant roboticist, you know, and roboticists are valuable on Solaria. I suppose they stretched a point. Except I think 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗧 was going to stop working with 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗧. He told me once 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗧 was a bad Solarian." "Did he tell 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗧 that?" "I don't know. He was working with 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗧 to the end. But I thought 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗧 was a bad Solarian for refusing to marry. 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗧 once said that marriage was the hardest thing in life, but that it had to be endured." "What did you think?" "About what, Elijah?" "About marriage. Did you think it was the hardest thing in life?" Her expression grew slowly blank, as though she were painstakingly washing emotion out of it. She said, I never thought about it. Bailey said, You said you go on walks with Jonathan 𝗧𝗵𝗲 all the time, then corrected yourself and put that in the past. You don't go on walks with him any more, then? Gladia shook her head. Expression was back in her face. Sadness. No, we don't seem to. I viewed him once or twice. He always seemed busy, and I don't like to, you know. Was this since the death of your husband? No, even some time before. Several months before. Do you suppose Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 ordered him not to pay further attention to you? Gladia looked startled. Why should he? Trothan isn't a robot, and neither am I. How can we take orders, and why should 𝗓𝗓𝗓 give them? Bailey did not bother to try to explain. He could have done so only in Earth terms, and that would make things no clearer to her. And if it did manage to clarify, the results would only be disgusting to her. Bailey said, Only a question. I'll view you again, Gladia, when I'm done with 𝗧𝗵𝗲. What time do you have, by the way? He was sorry at once for asking the question. Robots would answer in terrestrial equivalents, but Gladia might answer in Solarian units, and Bailey was weary of displaying ignorance. But Gladia answered in purely qualitative terms. Mid-afternoon, she said. Oh, then that's it for 𝗧𝗵𝗲's estate also. Oh, yes. Good. I'll view you again as soon as I can, and we'll make arrangements for seeing. Again, she grew hesitant. Is it absolutely necessary? It is, she said in a low voice. Very well. There was some delay in contacting 𝗧𝗵𝗲, and Bailey utilized it in consuming another sandwich, one that had been brought to him in its original packaging, but he had grown more cautious. He inspected the seal carefully before breaking it, then looked over its contents painstakingly. He accepted the plastic container of milk, not quite unfrozen, bit an opening with his own teeth, and drank from it directly. He thought gloomily that there were such things as odorless, tasteless, slow-acting poisons that could be introduced delicately by means of hypodermic needles or high-pressure needle jets. That put the thought aside as being childish. So far, murders and attempted murders have been committed in the most direct possible fashions. There was nothing delicate or subtle about a blow on the head, enough poison in a glass to kill a dozen men, or a poisoned arrow shot openly at the victim. Then he thought, scarcely less gloomily, that as long as he hopped between time zones in this fashion, he was scarcely likely to have regular meals. Or if this continued, regular sleep. The robot approached him. Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 directs you to call sometime tomorrow. He is engaged in an important work. Bailey bounced to his feet and roared, You tell that guy! He stopped. There was no use in yelling at a robot. That is, you could yell if you wished, but it would achieve results no sooner than a whisper. He said in a conversational tone, You tell Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, or his robot, if that is as far as you've reached, that I'm investigating the murder of a professional associate of his and a good Solarian. You tell him that I cannot wait on his work. You tell him that if I'm not viewing him in 5 minutes, I will be on a plane to his estate seeing him in less than an hour. You use that word seeing, so there's no mistake. He returned to his sandwich. In 5 minutes, they were not quite gone. The 5 minutes were not quite gone when 𝗧𝗵𝗲, or at least a Solarian whom Bailey presumed to be 𝗧𝗵𝗲, was glaring at him. Bailey glared back. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 was a lean man who held himself rigidly erect. His dark, prominent eyes had a look of intense abstraction about them, compounded now with anger. One of his eyelids dropped slightly. He said, Are you there, Earthman? Elijah Bailey, said Bailey, plainclothesman C7, in charge of the investigation into the murder of Dr. 𝗓𝗓𝗓. What is your name? I'm Dr. Jonathan 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Why do you presume to annoy me at my work? It's easy, said Bailey quietly. It's my business. Then take your business elsewhere. I have a few questions to ask first, Doctor. I believe you were a close associate of Dr. 𝗏𝗲𝗓, right? One of Liebig's hands clenched suddenly into a fist as he strode hastily toward a mantelpiece in which tiny clockwork contraptions went through complicated periodic motions that caught hypnotically at the eye. The viewer kept focus on Liebig so that his fingers did not depart from central projection as he walked. Rather, the room behind him seemed to move backwards in little rises and dips as he strode. Liebig said, "If you are the foreigner whom Gruer threatened to bring in, I am. Then you are here against my advice. Done viewing. Not yet. Don't break contact." Bailey raised his voice sharply, and a finger as well. He pointed it directly at the roboticist, who shrank visibly away from it, full lips spreading into an expression of disgust. Bailey said, "I wasn't bluffing about seeing you, you know." "No Earthman vulgarity, please. A straightforward statement is what it is intended to be. I will see you. If I can't make you listen any other way, I will grab you by the collar and make you listen." Liebig stared back. "You are a filthy animal. Have it your way, but I will do as I say. If you try to invade my estate, I will... Bailey lifted his eyes. "Kill me. Do you often make such threats?" "I made no threat." "Then talk now. In the time you have wasted, a good deal might have been accomplished. You are a close associate of Dr. 𝗏𝗏𝗓, right?" The roboticist's head lowered. His shoulders moved slightly in a slow, regular breathing. When he looked up, he was in command of himself. He even managed a brief, sapless smile. "I was. 𝗏𝗏𝗓 was interested in new types of robots, I understand." "He was. What kind?" "Are you a roboticist?" "No. Explain it for the layman." "I doubt that I can." "Try. For instance, I think he wanted robots capable of disciplining children." "What would that involve?" Liebig raised his eyebrows briefly and said, "To put it very simply, skipping all the subtle details, it means a strengthening of the C integral governing the Sikorovic tandem route response at the W65 level." "Double talk," said Bailey. "The truth. It's double talk to me. How else can you put it?" "It means a certain weakening of the first law." "Why so?" "The children are disciplined for its own future good. Isn't that the theory?" "Ah, the future good." Liebig's eyes glowed with passion as he seemed to grow less conscious of his listener and correspondingly more talkative. "A simple concept, you think. How many human beings are willing to accept a trifling inconvenience for the sake of a larger future good? How long does it take to train a child that what tastes good now means a stomachache later, and what tastes bad now will correct the stomachache later? Yet you want a robot to be able to understand. Pain inflicted by a robot on a child sets up a powerful disruptive potential in the positronic brain. To counteract that by an anti-potential triggered through a realization of future good requires enough paths and bypaths to increase the mass of the positronic brain by 50%, unless other circuits are sacrificed." Bailey said, "Then you haven't succeeded in building such a robot." "No, nor am I likely to succeed. Nor anyone." Was Dr. 𝗏𝗏𝗓 testing an experimental model of such a robot at the time of his death? "Not of such a robot. We were interested in other more practical things also." Bailey said quietly, "Dr. Liebig, I'm going to have to learn a bit more about robotics if I'm going to ask you to teach me. And I'm going to ask you to teach me." Liebig shook his head violently, and his drooping eyelids dipped further in a ghastly travesty of a wink. "It should be obvious that a course in robotics takes more than a moment. I lack the time. Nevertheless, you must teach me. The smell of robots is the one thing that pervades everything on Solaria. If it is time we require, then more than ever I must see you. I'm an Earthman and I cannot work or think comfortably while viewing." It would not have seemed possible for Liebig to stiffen his stiff carriage further, but he did. He said, Your phobias as an Earthman don't concern me. Seeing is impossible. I think you will change your mind when I tell you what I chiefly want to consult you about. It will make no difference. Nothing can. No? Then listen to this. It is my belief that throughout the history of the positronic robot, the first thought of robotics has been deliberately misquoted. Lepig moved spasmodically. Misquoted? Fool! Madman! Why? To hide the fact, said Bailey with complete composure, that robots can commit murder. Chapter 14th. A motive is revealed. Lepig's mouth widened softly. Bailey took it for a snarl at first and then, with considerable surprise, decided that it was the most unsuccessful attempt at a smile that he had ever seen. Lepig said, "Don't say that. Don't ever say that." "Why not?" "Because anything, however small, that encourages distrust of robots is harmful. Distrusting robots is a human disease." It was as though he was lecturing a small child. It was as though he were saying something gently that he wanted to yell. It was as though he were trying to persuade, when what he really wanted was to enforce on penalty of death. Lepig said, "Do you know the history of robotics?" "A little." "On Earth you should. Yes. Do you know robots started with a Frankenstein complex against them? They were suspect. Men distrusted and feared robots. Robotics was almost an undercover science as a result. The 3 laws were first built into robots in an effort to overcome distrust, and even so, Earth would never allow a robotic society to develop. One of the reasons the first pioneers left Earth to colonize the rest of the galaxy was so that they might establish societies in which robots would be allowed to free men of poverty and toil. Even then, there remained the latent suspicion, not far below, ready to pop up at any excuse. "Have you yourself had to counter distrust of robots?" asked Bailey. "Many times," said Lepig grimly. "Is that why you and other roboticists are willing to distort the facts just a little in order to avoid suspicion as much as possible?" "There are no distortions. For instance, aren't the 3 laws misquoted?" "No. I can demonstrate that they are. And unless you convince me otherwise, I will demonstrate it to the whole galaxy if I can." "You're mad. Whatever argument you may think you have is fallacious, and I assure you. Shall we discuss it?" "If it does not take too long. Face to face, seeing." Lepig's thin face twisted. "No." "Goodbye, Dr. Lepig. Others will listen to me." Wait, Galaxy Man, wait! Seeing. The roboticist's hand wandered upward, hovering about his chin. Slowly, a thumb crept into his mouth and remained there. He stared blankly at Bailey. Bailey thought, is he regressing to the pre-5-year-old stage so that it will be illegitimate for him to see me? "Seeing," he said. But Lepig shook his head slowly. I can't, he moaned, the words all but stifled by his blocking thumb. "Do whatever you want." Bailey stared at the other and watched him turn away and face the wall. He watched the Solarian's straight back bend, and then the Solarian's face hide in shaking hands. Bailey said, "Very well then, I'll agree to view." Lepig said, back still turned, "Excuse me a moment. I'll be back." Bailey tended to his own needs during the interval and stared at his fresh-washed face in the bathroom mirror. Was he getting the feel of Solaria and Solarians? He wasn't sure. He sighed and pushed a contact and a robot appeared. He didn't turn to look at it. He said, "Is there another viewer at the farm besides the one I'm using?" "There are 3 other outlets, Master." "Then tell Clarissa Contoro. Tell your mistress that I will be using this one till further notice, and that I am not to be disturbed." "Yes, Master." Bailey returned to his position, where the viewer remained focused on an empty patch of room in which Lepig had stood. It was still empty, and he settled himself to wait. It wasn't long. Lepig entered, and the room once more jiggled as the man walked. Evidently, focus shifted from room center to man center without delay. Bailey remembered the complexity of viewing controls and began to feel a kind of appreciation of what was involved. Lepig was quite master of himself now, apparently. His hair was slicked back, and his costume had been changed. His clothes fitted loosely, and were of a material that glistened and caught highlights. He sat down in a slim chair, and that folded out of the wall. He said, soberly, "Now what is this notion of yours concerning first law?" "Will we be overheard?" "No, I've taken care." Bailey nodded. He said, "Let me quote the first law." "I scarcely need that." "I know, but let me quote it anyway. A robot may not harm a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm." "Well?" "Now, when I first landed on Solaria, I was driven to the estate assigned for my use in a ground car. The ground car was a specifically enclosed job designed to protect me from the exposure of outer space. As an Earthman, I know all about that," said Lepig impatiently. "What has this to do with the matter?" "The robots who drove the car did not know about it. I asked that the car be opened and was at once obeyed. Second law. They had to follow orders. I was uncomfortable, of course, and nearly collapsed before the car was enclosed again." "Didn't the robots harm me?" "At your order," snapped Lepig. "I'll quote the second law. A robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. So, you see, my order should have been ignored." "This is nonsense." "The robot lacked knowledge." Bailey leaned forward in his chair. "Ah, we have it. Now let's recite the first law as it should be stated. A robot may do nothing that, to its knowledge, will harm a human being, nor, through inaction, knowingly allow a human being to come to harm." "This is all understood." "I think not by ordinary men. Otherwise, ordinary men would realize robots could commit murder." Lepig was white. "Mad. Lunacy." Bailey stared at his finger ends. "A robot may perform an innocent task, I suppose, one that has no damaging effect on a human being, if ordered to do so," said Lepig. "Yes, of course, if ordered to do so. And a second robot may perform an innocent task also, I suppose, one that also can have no damaging effect on a human being, if ordered to do so." "Yes." "And what if the two innocent tasks, each completely innocent, completely amount to murder when added together?" "What?" Lepig's face puckered into a scowl. "I want your expert opinion on the matter," said Bailey. "I'll set you a hypothetical case. Suppose a man says to a robot, 'Place a small quantity of this liquid into a glass of milk that you will find in such and such a place. The liquid is harmless. I wish only to know its effect on milk. Once I know the effect, the mixture will be poured out. After you have performed this action, forget you have done so.'" Lepig, still scowling, said nothing. Bailey said, "If I had told the robot to add a mysterious liquid to milk and then offer it to a man, first law would force it to ask, 'What is the nature of the liquid? Will it harm a man?' And if it were assured the liquid was harmless, first law might still make a robot hesitate and refuse to offer the milk. Instead, however, it is told the milk will be poured out. First law is not involved. Won't the robot do as it is told?" Lepig glared. Bailey said, "Now a second robot has poured out the milk in the first place and is unaware that the milk has been tampered with. In all innocence, it offers the milk to a man and the man dies." Lepig cried out, "No!" "Why not?" Both actions are innocent in themselves. Only together are they murder. Do you deny that this sort of thing can happen? The murderer would be the man who gave the order, cried 𝗏𝗡𝗍. If you want to be philosophical, yes. The robot would have been an immediate murderer, though the instrument of murder. No man would give such orders. A man would. A man has. It is exactly in this way that the murder attempt on Dr. Gruer must have been carried through. You've heard about that, I suppose. On Solaria, muttered 𝗏𝗏𝗍𝗏, one hears about everything. Then you know Gruer was poisoned at his dinner table before the eyes of myself and my partner, Mr. Oliver of Aurora. Can you suggest any other way in which the poison might have reached him? There was no other humans on the estate. As a Solarian, you must appreciate that point. I'm no detective. I have no theories. I've presented you with one. I want to know if it is a possible one. I want to know if two robots might not perform two separate actions, each one innocent in itself, the two together resulting in murder. You're the expert, Dr. 𝗏𝗏𝗍𝗏. Is it possible? Dr. 𝗏𝗏𝗍𝗏, haunted and harried, said, yes, in a voice so low that Bailey scarcely heard him. Bailey said, very well then, so much for the first law. 𝗏𝗏𝗍𝗏 stared at Bailey, and his drooping eyelid winked once or twice in a slow tick. His hands, which had been clasped, drew apart, though the fingers maintained their claw shape as though each hand still entwined a phantom hand in air. Palms turned downward and rested on knees, and only then did the fingers relax. Bailey watched it all in abstraction. 𝗏𝗏𝗍𝗏 said, theoretically, yes. Theoretically. But don't dismiss the first law that easily, Earthmen. Robots would have to be ordered very cleverly in order to circumvent the first law. Granted, said Bailey. I am only an Earthman. I know next to nothing about robots, and my phrasing of the orders was only by way of example. A Solarian would be much more subtle and do much better. I'm sure of that. 𝗏𝗏𝗍𝗏 might not have been listening. He said loudly, if a robot can be manipulated into doing harm to a man, it means only that we must extend the powers of the positronic brain. One might say we ought to make the human better. That is impossible, so we will make the robot more foolproof. We advance continuously. Our robots are more varied, more specialized, more capable, and more unharming than those of a century ago. A century hence, we will have still greater advances. Why have a robot manipulate controls when a positronic brain can be built into the controls itself? That's specialization, but we can generalize also. Why not a robot with replaceable and interchangeable limbs? Why not, if we... Bailey interrupted. Are you the only roboticist on Solaria? Don't be a fool. I only wondered. Dr. 𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏 was the only fetal engineer, except for an assistant. Solaria has over 20 roboticists. Are you the best? I am, said 𝗏𝗏𝗍𝗏 without self-consciousness. 𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏 worked with you. He did. Bailey said, I understand that he was planning to break the partnership towards the end. No sign of it. What gave you the idea? I understood he disapproved of your bachelorhood. He may have. He was a thorough Solarian. However, it did not affect our business relationship. To change the subject, in addition to developing new model robots, you also manufacture and repair existing types. 𝗏𝗏𝗍𝗏 said, manufacture and repair are largely robot-conducted. There is a large factory and maintenance shop on my estate. Do robots require much in the way of repair, by the way? Very little. Does that mean that robot repair is an underdeveloped science? Not at all. 𝗏𝗏𝗍𝗏 said that stiffly. What about the robots that was at the scene of Dr. 𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏's murder? Liebig looked away, and his eyebrows drew together as though a painful thought were being barred entrance to his mind. It was a complete loss. Really complete. Could it answer any questions at all? None at all. It was absolutely useless. Its polytronic brain was completely short-circuited. Not one pathway was left intact. Consider, it had witnessed a murder it had been able to halt. Why was it unable to halt the murder, by the way? Who can tell? Dr. 𝗏𝗲 was experimenting with the robot. I do not know in what mental condition he had left it. He might have ordered it, for instance, to suspend all operations while he checked one particular circuit element. If someone whom neither Dr. 𝗏𝗲 nor the robot suspected of harm were suddenly to launch a homicidal attack, there might be a perceptible interval before the robot could use the first law potential to overcome Dr. 𝗏𝗲's freezing order. The length of that interval would depend on the nature of the attack and the nature of Dr. 𝗏𝗲's freezing order. I could invent a dozen other ways of explaining why a robot wasn't able to prevent the murder. Being unable to do so was a first law violation, however, and that was sufficient to blast every positronic pathway in the robot's mind. But if the robot were physically unable to prevent the murder, was it responsible? Does the first law ask impossibilities? Liebig shrugged. The first law, despite your attempts to make little of it, protects humanity with every atom of possible force. It allows no excuses. If the first law is broken, the robot is ruined. That is a universal rule, sir. As universal as robots. Bailey said. Then I've learned something. Then learn something else. Your theory of murder by a series of robotic actions, each innocent in itself, will not help you in the case of Dr. 𝗏𝗲's death. Why not? The death was not by poisoning, but by bludgeoning. Something had to hold this bludgeon, and that hand had to be a human arm. No robot could swing a club and smash a skull. Suppose, said Bailey, a robot were to push an innocent button which dropped a booby-trap weight on 𝗏𝗲's head. Liebig smiled sourly. Earthman, I've viewed the scene of the crime. I've heard all the news. The murder was a big thing here on Solaria, you know. So I know there was no sign of any machinery at the scene of the crime, or of any fallen weight. Bailey said, or of any blunt instrument either. Liebig said scornfully, You're a detective? Find it. Granting that a robot was not responsible for Dr. 𝗏𝗲's death, who was then? Everyone knows who was, shouted Liebig. His wife, Gladia. Bailey thought, at least there's a unanimity in opinion. Aloud, he said, and who was the mastermind behind the robots who poisoned Gruer? I suppose, Liebig trailed off. You don't think there are two murderers, do you? If Gladia was responsible for one crime, she must be responsible for the second attempt also. Yes, you must be right. The voice gained assurance. No doubt of it. No doubt. Sorry. Not sorry. Whatever. Nobody else could get close enough to Dr. 𝗏𝗲 to kill him. He allowed personnel presence no more than I did, except that he made an exception in favor of his wife, and I made no exceptions. The wiser, I. The roboticist laughed harshly. I believe you knew her, said Bailey abruptly. Whom? Her. We are discussing only one her. Gladia. Who told you I knew her any more than I know anyone else? Demanded Liebig. He put his hand to his throat. His fingers moved slightly and opened the neck stream of his garment an inch downward, leaving more freedom to breathe. Gladia herself did. You two went for walks. So, we were neighbors. It is a common thing to do. She seemed a pleasant person. You approved of her, then? Liebig shrugged. Talking to her was relaxing. What did you talk about? Robotics. There was a flavor of surprise about the word, as though he were as though there were wonder that the question could be asked. And she talked robotics too. She knew nothing about robotics, ignorant, but she listened. She has had some of force field rigmarole she plays with, field coloring she calls it. I have no patience with that, but I listened. All this without personal presence. Liebig looked revolted and did not answer. Bailey tried again. Were you attracted to her? What? Did you find her attractive, physically? Even Liebig's bad eyelid lifted and his lips quivered. Filthy animal, he muttered. Let me put it this way, then. When did you cease finding Gladia pleasant? You used that word yourself, if you remember. What do you mean? You said you found her pleasant. Now you believe she murdered her husband. That isn't the mark of a pleasant person. I was mistaken about her. But you decided you were mistaken before she killed her husband, if she did so. You stopped walking with her some time before the murder. Why? Liebig said, Is that important? Everything is important till proven otherwise. Look, if you want information from me as a roboticist, ask me. I won't answer personal questions. Bailey said, You were closely associated with both murdered man and the chief suspect. Don't you see that personal questions are unavoidable? Why did you stop walking with Gladia? Liebig snapped. There came a time when I ran out of things to say, when I was too busy, when I found no reason to continue to talk. When you no longer found her pleasant, in other words. All right, put it so. Why was she no longer pleasant? Liebig shouted, I have no reason. Bailey ignored the other's excitement. You are still someone who she knows. You are still someone who has known Gladia well. What could her motive be? Her motive. No one has suggested any motive for the murder. Surely Gladia wouldn't commit murder without a motive. Great galaxy. Liebig leaned his head back as though to laugh. Didn't. No one told you. Well, perhaps no one knew. I knew, though. She told me. She told me frequently. Told you what, Dr. Liebig? Why, that she quarreled with her husband. Quarreled bitterly and frequently. She hated him, Earthman. Didn't anyone tell you? Didn't she tell you? Chapter 15. A portrait is colored. And cheers to anybody enjoying the story too. Bailey took it between the eyes and tried not to show it. Presumably, living as they did, Solarians considered one another's private lives to be sacrosanct. Questions concerning marriage and children were in bad taste. He supposed then that chronic quarreling could exist between husband and wife and be a matter into which the curiosity was equally forbidden. But even when murder had been committed, would no one commit the social crime of asking the suspect if she quarreled with her husband, or of mentioning the matter if they happened to know of it? Well, Liebig had. Bailey said, What did the quarrels concern? You had better ask her, I think. He better had, thought Bailey. He rose stiffly. Thank you, Dr. Liebig, for your cooperation. I may need your help again later. I hope you will keep yourself available. Done viewing, said Liebig, and he and the segment of his room vanished abruptly. For the first time, Bailey found himself not minding a plane flight through open space, not minding it at all. It was almost as though he were in his own element. He wasn't even thinking of Earth or of Jessie. He had been away from Earth only a matter of weeks, yet it might as well have been years. He had been on Solaria only for the better part of 3 days, and yet it seemed forever. How fast could a man adapt to nightmare? Or was it Gladia? He would be seeing her soon, not viewing her. Was that what gave him confidence in his odd feeling of mixed apprehension and anticipation? Would she endure it, he wondered, or would she slip away after a few moments of seeing, begging off as 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had done? She stood at the other end of a long room when he entered. She might have almost been an impressionistic representation of herself. She was so reduced to the essentials. Her lips were faintly red, her eyebrows lightly penciled. Her earlobes faintly blue, and except for that, her face was untouched. She looked pale, a little frightened, and very young. Her brown blonde hair was drawn back, and the gray-blue eyes were somehow shy. Her dress was a blue so dark as to be almost black, with a thin white edging curling down each side. She wore long sleeves, white gloves, and flat-heeled shoes. Not an inch of skin showed anywhere but on her face. Even her neck was covered by a kind of unobtrusive ruching. Bailey stopped where he was. "Is this close enough, Gladia?" She was breathing with shallow quickness. She said, "I had forgotten what to expect, really. It's just like viewing, isn't it? I mean, if you don't think of it as seeing." Bailey said, "It's all quite normal to me." "Yes, on Earth." She closed her eyes. "Sometimes I try to imagine it. Just crowds of people everywhere. You walk down a road and there are others walking with you, and still others walking in the opposite direction. Dozens, hundreds," said Bailey. "Did you ever view scenes on Earth in a book film, or view a novel with an Earth setting?" "We don't have many of those, but I've viewed novels set on other outer worlds where seeing goes on all the time. It's different in a novel. It just seems like a multi-view." "Do people ever kiss in novels?" She flushed painfully. "I don't read that kind." "Never?" "Well, there are always a few dirty films around, you know, and sometimes just out of curiosity. It's sickening, really." "Is it?" she said with sudden animation. "But Earth is so different. So many people. When you walk, Elijah, I suppose you even touch people. I mean by accident." Bailey half smiled. "You even knock them down by accident." He thought of the crowds on the expressways tugging and shoveling, pounding up and down the strips, and for a moment, inevitably, he felt a pang of homesickness. Gladia said, "You don't have to stay way out there." "Oh, sorry." Gladia said, "You don't have to stay way out there." "Would it be all right if I came closer?" "I think so." "I'll tell you when I'd rather you wouldn't anymore." Stepwise, Bailey drew closer, while Gladia watched him wide-eyed. She said suddenly, "Would you like to see some of my field colorings?" Bailey was 6 feet away. He stopped and looked at her. She seemed small and fragile. He tried to visualize her, something in hand. What? Swinging furiously at the skull of her husband. He tried to picture her, mad with rage, homicidal with hate and anger. He had to admit it could be done. Even a 105-pound woman could crush his skull if she had the proper weapon and were wild enough. And Bailey had known murderesses, on Earth of course, who, in repose, were bunny rabbits. He said, "What are field colorings, Gladia?" "An art form," she said. Bailey remembered Liebig's indifference to Gladia's art. He nodded. "I'd like to see some." "Follow me, then." Bailey maintained a careful 6-foot distance between them. At that, it was less than a third the distance Clarissa had demanded. They entered a room that burst with light. It glowed in every corner and every color. Gladia looked pleased, proprietary. She looked up at Bailey, eyes anticipating. Bailey's response must have been what she expected. Though he said nothing, he turned slowly, trying to make out what he saw, but it was only light, no material object at all. The goblets of light sat on embracing pedestals. They were living geometry, lines and curves of color, entwined into a coalescing whole, yet maintaining distinct identities. No two specimens were even remotely alike. Bailey groped for appropriate words and said, "Is it supposed to mean anything?" Lydia laughed in her pleasant contralto. "It means whatever you like it to mean. They're just light forms that might make you feel angry or happy or curious or whatever I felt when I constructed one. I could make one for you, a kind of portrait. It might not be very good, though, because I would just be improvising quickly." "Would you?" "I would be very interested." "All right," she said, and half ran to a light figure on one corner. Passing within inches of him as she did so, she did not seem to notice. She touched something on the pedestal of the light figure, and the glory above died without a flicker. Bailey gasped and said, "Don't do that." "It's all right. I was tired of it anyway. I'll just fade the others temporarily so they don't distract me." She opened a panel along one featureless wall and moved a retostat. The colors faded to something scarcely visible. Bailey said, "Don't you have a robot to do this? Closing contacts?" "Shush now," she said impatiently. "I don't keep robots in here. This is me." She looked at him, frowning. "I don't know you well enough. That's the trouble." She wasn't looking at the pedestal, but her fingers rested lightly on the smooth surface. All 10 fingers were curved, tense, waiting. One finger moved, describing a half-curve over smoothness. A bar of deep yellow light grew and slanted obliquely across the open air. The finger inched backwards a fraction, and the light grew slightly less, deep in shade. She looked at it momentarily. "I suppose that's it. A kind of strength without weight." "Jehoshaphat," said Bailey. "Are you offended?" Her fingers lifted and the yellow slant of light remained solitary and stationary. "No, not at all, but what is it? How do you do it?" "That's hard to explain," said Lydia, looking at the pedestal thoughtfully. "Considering I don't really understand it myself, it's a kind of optic illusion, I've been told. We set up force fields at different energy levels. They're extrusions of hyperspace, really, and don't have the properties of ordinary space at all. Depending on the energy level, the human eye sees light of different shades. The shapes and color are controlled by the warmth of my fingers against appropriate spots on the pedestal. There are all sorts of controls inside each pedestal." "You mean if I were to put my fingers there?" Bailey advanced and Gladia made way for him. He put a hesitant forefinger down upon the pedestal and felt a soft throbbing. "Go ahead. Move your finger, Elijah," said Gladia. Bailey did so, and a dirty gray jag of light lifted upwards, skewing the yellow light. Bailey withdrew his finger sharply, and Gladia laughed, and then was instantly contrite. "I shouldn't laugh," she said. "It's really very hard to do, even for people who've tried a long time." Her own hand moved lightly and too quickly for Bailey to follow, and the monstrosity he had set up disappeared, leaving the yellow light in isolation again. "How did you learn to do this?" asked Bailey. "I just kept on trying. It's a new form of art, you know. Only one or two really know how." "And you're the best," said Bailey somberly. "On Solaria, everyone is either the only or the best of both." "You needn't laugh. I've had some of my pedestals on display. I've given shows." Her chin lifted. There was no mistaking her pride. She continued, "Let me go on with your portrait." Her fingers moved again. There were a few curves in the light form that grew under her ministrations. It was all sharp angles, and the dominant color was blue. "That's Earth, somehow," said 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗧, biting her lower lip. "I always think of Earth as blue. All those people and seeing. Viewing is more rose. How does it seem to you?" "Jehoshaphat, I can't picture things as colors." "Can't you?" she asked abstractly. "Now you say Jehoshaphat sometimes, and that's a little blob of violet. A little sharp blob, because it usually comes out ping like that." And the little blob was there, glowing just off-center. "And then," she said, "I can finish it like this, and a flat, lusterless, hollow cube of slate gray sprang up to enclose everything. The light within shone through, but dimmer, imprisoned somehow." Bailey felt a sadness at it, as though it were something enclosing him, keeping him from something he wanted. He said, "What's that last?" 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗧 said, "Why, the walls about you. That's what's most in you. That's why you can't go outside, the way you have to be inside. You are inside there, don't you see?" Bailey saw, and somehow he disapproved. He said, "Those walls aren't permanent. I've been out today." "Have you? Did you mind?" He could not resist a counter-dig. "The way you mind seeing me. You don't like it, but you can stand it." She looked at him thoughtfully. "Do you want to come out now with me for a walk?" It was Bailey's impulse to say, "Jehoshaphat, no." She said, "I've never walked with anyone seeing. It's still daytime, and it's pleasant weather." Bailey looked at his abstractionist portrait and said, "If I go, will you take away the gray?" She smiled and said, "I'll see how you behave." The structure of light remained as they left the room. It stayed behind, holding Bailey's imprisoned soul fast in the gray of the cities. Bailey shivered slightly. Air moved against him, and there was a chill to it. 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗧 said, "Are you cold?" "It wasn't like this before," muttered Bailey. "It's late in the day now, but it isn't really cold. Would you like a coat? One of the robots could bring you one in a minute." "No, it's all right." They stepped forward along a narrow path. He said, "Is this where you used to walk with Dr. Liebig?" "Oh no, we walked way out amongst the fields. There you only see an occasional robot working, and you can hear the animal sounds. You and I will stay near that house, though, just in case." "In case what?" "Well, in case you want to go in. Or in case you get weary of seeing." "It doesn't bother me," she said recklessly. There was a vague rustle of leaves above, and an all-pervading yellowness and greenness. There were sharp, thin cries in the air above, plus a strident humming of shadows, too. And shadows, too. He was especially aware of the shadows. One of them struck out before him in the shape of a man that moved as he did in horrible mimicry. Bailey had heard of shadows, of course, and he did not know what they were. But in the pervasive, indirect lighting of the cities, he had never been specifically aware of one. Behind him, he knew, was the Solarian sun. He took care not to look at it, but he knew it was there. Space was large. Space was lonely. Yet he found it drawing him in. His mind pictured himself striding the surface of a world with thousands of miles and light years of room all above him. Why should he find attraction in this thought of loneliness? He didn't want loneliness. He wanted Earth and the warmth of companionship of the man-crammed cities. The picture failed him. He tried to conjure up New York in his mind, all the noise and fullness of it, and he found he could remain conscious only of the quiet, air moving chill, of the surface of Solaria. Without quite willing it, Bailey moved closer to Gladia, and he was 2 feet away, then grew aware of her startled face. "I beg your pardon," he said at once, and drew off. She gasped. "It's all right. Won't you walk this way? We have some flower beds you might like." The direction she indicated lay away from the sun. Bailey followed silently. Gladia said, "Later in the year, it will be wonderful. In the warm weather I can run down to the lake and swim, or just run across the fields, run as fast as I can until I'm just glad to fall down and lie still." She looked down at herself. "But this is no costume for it. With all this on, I've got to walk. Sedately, you know." "How would you prefer to dress?" asked Bailey. "Halter and shorts at the most," she cried, lifting her arms as though feeling the freedom of that in her imagination. "Sometimes less. Sometimes just sandals so you can feel the air with every Oh, I'm sorry, I've offended you." Bailey said, "No, it's all right. Was that your custom when you went walking with Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲? "It varied. It depended on the weather. Sometimes I wore very little, but it was viewing, you know." "You do understand, I hope." "I understand. What about Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, though? Did he dress lightly, too?" "Chothan dressed lightly." Gladia smiled flashingly. "Oh, no. He's very solemn, always." She twisted her face into a thin look of gravity and half winked, catching the very essence of 𝗧𝗵𝗲 and forcing a short grunt of appreciation out of Bailey. "This is the way he talks," she said. "My dear Gladia, in considering the effect of the first-order potential on positron flow, is that what he talked to you most about?" Robotics. "Mostly. Oh, he talked so seriously, you know. He was always trying to teach me about it. He never gave up." "Did you learn anything?" "Not one thing. Nothing. It's just all a complete mix-up to me. He'd get angry with me sometimes, but when he'd scold, I'd dive into the water, if we were anywhere near the lake, and splash him." "Splash him? I thought you were viewing." She laughed. "You're such an Earthman. I'd splash where he was standing in his own room, or on his estate. The water couldn't touch him, but he would duck just the same, just like that." Bailey looked. They had circled a wooded path and now came upon a clearing centered about an ornamental pond. Small bricked walks penetrated the clearing and broke it up. Flowers grew in profusion and order. Bailey knew them for flowers from book films he had viewed. It was the way the flowers were like the light patterns. In a way, the flowers were like the light patterns that Gladia constructed, and Bailey imagined that she constructed them in the spirit of flowers. He touched one cautiously, then looked about. Reds and yellows predominated. And turning to look about, Bailey caught a glimpse of the sun. He said uneasily, "The sun is low in the sky." "It's late afternoon," called Gladia back to him. She had run towards the pond and was sitting on a stone bench at its edge. "Come here," she shouted, waving. "You can stand if you don't like to sit on stone." Bailey advanced slowly. "Does it get this low every day?" And at once he was sorry he asked. If the planet rotated, the sun must be low in the sky both morning and afternoons. Only at midday could it be high. Telling himself this couldn't change a lifetime of pictured thought. He knew there was such a thing as night, and had even experienced it, with the planet's whole thickness interposing safely between a man and the sun. He knew there were clouds and a protective grayness hiding the worst of the outdoors. And still, when he thought of planetary surfaces, there was always a picture of the blaze of light with the sun high in the sky. He looked over his shoulder. just quickly enough to get a flash of sun, and wondered how far the house was if he should decide to return. Bailey was pointing to the other end of the stone bench. Bailey said, "It's pretty close to you, isn't it?" She spread out her hands a little, palms up. "I'm getting used to it. Really." He sat down, facing toward her to avoid the sun. She leaned over backwards towards the water and pulled a small cup-shaped flower, yellow without and white streaks within. "Not at all flamboyant," she said. "This is a native plant. Most of the flowers here are from Earth originally." Water dripped from its severed stem as she extended it gingerly to Bailey. Bailey reached for it gingerly. "You killed it," she said. He said, "It's only a flower. There are thousands of them." Suddenly, before his fingers more than touched the yellow cup, she snatched it away, her eyes kindling. "Or are you trying to imply I could kill a human being because I pulled a flower?" Bailey said in soft conciliation, "I wasn't implying anything. May I see it?" Bailey didn't really want to touch it. It had grown in the wet soil, and there was still an effluvium of mud about it. How could these people, who were so careful to contact with Earthmen and even with one another, how could these people who were so careful in contact with Earthmen and even with one another be so careless in their contact with ordinary dirt? But he held the stalk between thumb and forefinger and looked at it. The cup was formed of several thin pieces of papery tissue, curving up from a common center. Within it was a white convex swelling, damp with liquid and fringed with dark hairs that trembled lightly in the wind. She said, "Can you smell it?" At once, Bailey was aware of the odor that emanated from it. He leaned toward it and said, "It smells like a woman's perfume." Lydia clapped her hands in delight. "How like an Earthman! What you really mean is that a woman's perfume smells like that." Bailey nodded ruefully. He was growing weary of the outdoors. The shadows were getting longer, and the land was becoming somber. He was determined not to give in. He wanted those gray walls of light that dimmed his portrait removed. It was quixotic, but there it was. Gladia looked from the flower to Bailey and let it go without reluctance. Slowly, she pulled the petals apart. She said, "I suppose every woman smells different." "It depends on the perfume," said Bailey indifferently. "Imagine being close enough to tell. I don't wear perfume because no one is close enough, except now. But I suppose you smell perfume often, all the time. On Earth, your wife is always with you, isn't she?" She was concentrating very hard on the flower, frowning as she plucked it carefully to pieces. "She's not always with me," said Bailey. "Not every minute. But most of the time, and whenever you want to," Bailey said suddenly. "Why did Dr. Liebig try so hard to teach you robotics, do you suppose?" The dismembered flower consisted now of a stalk and the inner swelling. Gladia twirled it between her fingers, then tossed it away, so that it floated for a moment on the surface of the pond. "I think he wanted me to be his assistant," she said. "Did he tell you so, Gladia?" "Toward the end, Elijah. I think he grew impatient. Anyway, he asked me if I didn't think it would be exciting to work in robotics. Naturally, I told him I could think of nothing duller. He was quite angry. And he never walked with you again after that." She said, "You know, I think that may have been it. I suppose his feelings were hurt. Really, though, what could I do?" "It was before that, though, that you told him about your quarrels with Dr. Delmar." Her hands became fists and held so in a tight spasm. Her body held stiffly to its position, head bent and a little to one side. Her voice was unnaturally high. What quarrels? Your quarrels with your husband. I understand you hated him. Her face was distorted and blotched as she glared at him. Who told you that? 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 mentioned it. I think it's true. She was shaken. You're still trying to prove I killed him. I keep thinking you're my friend, and you're only a detective. She raised her fists and Bailey waited. He said, "You know you can't touch me." Her hands dropped, and she began crying without a sound. She turned her head away. Bailey bent his own head and closed his eyes, shutting out the disturbing long shadows. He said, "Dr. 𝗏𝗲𝗓 was not a very affectionate man, was he?" She said in a strangled way, "He was a very busy man." Bailey said, "You are affectionate, on the other hand. You find a man interesting. Do you understand? I can't help it. I know it's disgusting, but I can't help it. It's even disgusting to talk about it." You did talk about it to Dr. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, though. I had to do something, and 𝗧𝗵𝗲 was handy, and he didn't seem to mind, and it made me feel better. Was this the reason you quarreled with your husband? Was it that he was cold and unaffectionate, and you resented it? Sometimes I hated him. She shrugged her shoulders helplessly. He was just a good Solarian, and we weren't scheduled for She broke down. Bailey waited. His own stomach was cold, and open air pressed down heavily upon him. When 𝗧𝗲𝗲's sobs grew quieter, he asked, as gently as he could, "Did you kill him, 𝗧𝗧𝗲𝗲?" No. Then suddenly, as though all resistance had corroded within her, "I haven't told you everything." "Well, then please do so now." "We were quarreling that time. The time he died. The old quarrel. I screamed at him, but he never shouted back. He hardly ever even said anything, and that just made it worse. I was so angry. I don't remember after that." "𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗧." Bailey swayed slightly, and his eyes sought the neutral stone of the bench. "What do you mean you don't remember?" "I mean, he was dead and I was screaming and the robots came." "Did you kill him?" "I don't remember it, Elijah, and I would remember it if I did, wouldn't I? Only I don't remember anything else either, and I've been so frightened. So frightened. Help me, please, Elijah." "Don't worry, 𝗧𝗲𝗲𝗓, I'll help you." Bailey's reeling mind fastened on the murder weapon. What happened to it? It must have been removed. If so, only the murderer could have done it. Since 𝗧𝗧𝗲𝗓 was found immediately after the murder on the scene, she could not have done it. The murderer would have been someone else. No matter how it looked to everyone else on Solaria, it had to be someone else. Bailey thought sickly. "I've got to get back to the house," he said. 𝗧𝗧𝗓𝗓. Somehow, he was staring at the sun. It was nearly at the horizon. He had to turn his head to look at it, and his eyes locked with a morbid fascination. He had never seen it so fat, red, and dim somehow, so that one could look at it without blinding, and see the bleeding clouds above it in thin lines, with one crossing it in a bar of black. Bailey mumbled, "The sun is so red." He heard 𝗧𝗧𝗓𝗏𝗧's choked voice say drearily, "It's always red at sunset, red and dying." Bailey had a vision. The sun was moving down to the horizon because the planet's surface was moving away from it, 1,000 miles an hour, spinning under that naked sun, spinning with nothing to guard the microbes called men. It scurried over the spinning surface, spinning madly forever, spinning, spinning. It was his head that was spinning, and the stone bench that was slanting beneath him, and the sky heaving, blue, dark blue, and the sun was gone, and the tops of the trees, and the ground rushing up, and Gladia screaming thinly, and another sound. This ends chapter the 15th. And this ends our time together for today. Return. I think we'll finish this in the next section to the chorus of much neighbors and traffic swirling outside the underground. All right. Bye.